Okay, so there are various different African communities in Israel and Palestine, and I'm only going to be talking about one of them, the African refugees. We're talking about a group, about 66,000 people originally. About 90% of them are from Sudan and from Eritrea. They're fleeing Omar Bashir, the war criminal, the president of Sudan, and they're fleeing the dictatorship in Eritrea. And this person has been in power since 1987. If you can imagine this, 63% of the people born or people living in Eritrea have only ever known this man as leader. So they're fleeing ethnic cleansing. They're fleeing abject slavery, essentially. And I'm just going to show you a map so you can see what I'm talking about. So you have Sudanese refugees fleeing ethnic cleansing, going towards Europe, but Gaddafi kind of cuts a deal with the European leaders to stop that in exchange for purchasing Libyan oil. And so then you see flow of refugees towards Egypt and eventually from there on to Israel, Eritreans joining the flow. Now, why didn't these refugees just stay in Egypt, the first country they got to? Well, they did. They tried to get there. They tried to ask for their refugee rights, and they were slaughtered in front of the UN building in Cairo. And when that happened, then people realized that's not going to provide them with any safe space, so they started moving on to Israel. Now, I just want to warn people, you may want to avert your eyes just for 1 minute. These are horrific images I'm about to show you, because on their way to Israel, so many of these people were kidnapped by human traffickers and were tortured in order to exploit them for money. They would call their relatives on mobile phones and say, if you do not give us money, transfer money through these shady bank accounts, we will continue to torture your relatives. And on the phone, this is where I'm about to show some horrific scenes. In addition to the usual tortures of beatings, executions, rape, gang rape, they invented new forms of torture. They would take plastic bags and they would drip them on people's bodies, scarring them permanently. This has been documented by many news crews in the Sinai Peninsula. So this is what they have to do to get to Israel. And once they arrive there, you wonder how a country as securified as Israel is able to allow these people. But at that point, the border with Africa, because Israel's in northeast Africa, so the African border with Egypt this is pretty much what it looked like. Not easy, but not insurmountable either. And so people passed, no one infiltrated, no one tried to get into the country and sneak past the authorities, and no one did that. Everyone crossed the border. According to international law, they cross the border, and they wait there for Israeli authorities to come by and pick them up and test them, make sure they don't have any communicable diseases, etc. But once they arrive, the Israeli government doesn't want to give them refugee rights. And so of all of the applications that are made, the Israeli government just ignores 80% of them, doesn't even look at them. And of those it does examine, it just outright rejects 99+ of those. And we're talking, of all Israel's entire population, we're talking about less than 1% of the population. But even that, as we heard from Mazen, this is considered a demographic threat. And so these people in other countries of the world, they do receive refugee rights, in large numbers. Here in the UK, even 71%. In other countries, much higher. In Israel, it's 0. There have been 4 Eritreans who have received refugee status and 0 Sudanese, if I'm not mistaken. And it's not that other countries in the region aren't taking in these refugees. We can see countries taking in tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions, and these numbers aren't even up to date. This is from several years ago. We just talked last night about Lebanon being something like 50% of its population almost, refugees at this point. Jordan also, these are Israel's 2 closest neighbors, Lebanon and Jordan, each taking in millions of refugees. I'm Syrian, but this is how people are contributing in the area to alleviate the refugee crisis. In Israel actually leads the world, having the highest refugee rejection rate of any country in the world. So, in the country, without the right to work, without any support from the government or the right to work and thereby sustain themselves, we have abject poverty in the community. The government sends these people to South Tel Aviv So essentially taking an impoverished neighborhood to begin with, and then turning it into a refugee camp, so putting two impoverished populations, one against the other. Of course, many people at first living on the streets, nowhere to go, with no help, and so people, out in the rain, and living in very cramped conditions, and very, very difficult to work. And when they find work, it's usually exploitative work. But at least people are no longer being ethnically cleansed. At least they've gotten away from the abject slavery, and so they can start a new life. But no, that's not enough. So this is how we see a report on Africans. I'm just going to quickly read it. I'm going to go back to a critique of Haaretz. So this is written in Haaretz. In the corners of the living quarters of Africans, you will find the filth, card games played for money, residents getting drunk, and prostitution. The Africans bring this way of life with them when they migrate. It's no wonder that crime in the country is on the upswing. Young women and even young men are again not safe going out on the streets alone after dark. Now, this was also written in Israeli daily liberal Haaretz, but it was written in 1949, okay? It was not written about these Africans. It was written about these Africans, the Mizrahim that Oli just spoke of, okay? And then we see even back in the day, there's this white supremacy, this pigmentocracy of people of color being vilified. And because, yes, we have nativism, where people who immigrated less recently think they deserve more privileges than those who immigrated more recently. And of course, white supremacy, people who feel they have less pigment believe they deserve more privileges than those with more pigment. But we also have now the extra added effect of Jewish supremacy. People who are Jewish or more Jewish in their own eyes believe they deserve more privileges than those who are not Jewish or less Jewish. And we see the institutions in Israeli society waging war against these African populations. We see chief rabbis from all around the country authoring an edict, a religious edict forbidding Jews to rent apartments to non-Jews and to Africans specifically. We see the mayor of Tel Aviv, he's since changed his tune, but then 2012 he urges the Israeli government to kick out all the Africans, and he sends his municipal inspectors to shut down their little makeshift businesses and their cafes, pouring bleach into their cooking pots. We see that even soup kitchens in Israel from Tel Aviv to Eilat refuse to serve Africans on principle. So this is the institutions. Then we have the government. Netanyahu comes to power, back to power, 2009. He appoints as his interior minister Eli Yishai. And Eli Yishai is, really builds his career on inciting hatred towards Africans. He says, most are Muslims who think the country doesn't belong to us white men. Says they bring with them a profusion of diseases, tuberculosis, AIDS, and drugs. Until I am able to deport them, I will jail them and make their lives miserable. All right, so this is the official government policy, and so he does. And he appoints one of Israel's mega racists, Arnon Sofer, to compile official government report on how to deal with these African refugees. And in his report, he recommends the concentration of the infiltrators, and that's exactly what the state of Israel does. So first of all, it does this by curtailing their visas, saying now you got to get your visas renewed every 3 months, 2 months, 1 month, and of course huge lineups, people waiting all day in the heat with their babies, sleeping on the ground outside to get these visas just for the right to be able to. But then quickly we see police rounding up Africans off city streets of Tel Aviv and other cities, and they know, this Sudanese man is about to get some kind of diploma because he just finished a course, an exception that proves the rule, someone who managed to succeed in Israeli society. So they know there's going to be Sudanese people there, and they swoop in on this graduation party, and they arrest Africans knowing they're going to be there, and take them, and they stop people on the streets in areas that are frequented by Africans. And even if you look Jewish, they'll ask you for your papers. Are you really Jewish? And if you're not, they rounded up people, and they're taking them down to this desert detention center in the south of the country, on the border with Egypt. There's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, it's in the middle of nowhere, it's just sand as far as you can see, and this is where they have thousands of African men living out their days and nights. And of course, the Supreme Court kind of tried to mediate it so that it would be watered down a little bit, it wouldn't be as horrific, but essentially, they've got furloughs, They're allowed to walk out and walk back in for a few hours every day to get some exercise, but complete crappy food. They have like really substandard medical services. Israel's high-tech marvel. It can send teams of people all over the world, but it can't provide decent medical. So you have human rights groups coming out on the weekends and doing medical clinics on the ground because the government can't even provide. Because the whole point is not to actually give them a place to be. The idea is, as the Interior Minister said, to make their lives miserable so that they will eventually give up and self-deport back to Africa. That's the goal. And so that's what people eventually do, because they realize the government is determined to get them out. Nothing they're going to do is going to change matters. So thousands of these men and women decide they will accept the government's bribe to leave the country in exchange for a couple $1,000s. And sure enough, but we see now the statistics that the government said they were going to send them to safe places where they would be able to find a new life elsewhere. But sure enough, turns out 68% of those refugees they coerced to self-deport have been sent back to the tortures they fled from, back to Sudan, back to Eritrea. Major, massive violation of refugee rights. And of those 32% that weren't sent to Sudan and Eritrea, the ones sent to these countries Israel supposedly secured arrangements with, since then they have had to continually flee and leave those countries to find refuge elsewhere, reaching as far as Scandinavia and South Africa. And the sickening part of sending these people back to South Africa, to the African continent, is that Israel has played no small role in some of the horrors that have taken place on the African continent in recent years. We heard about Israel's massive arms industry. And from the genocide in Rwanda, we don't know exactly, but no small amount of these people died from Israeli weapons, because Israeli arms manufacturers continued to sell weapons to militias engaging in genocide while the Rwanda ethnic cleansing was going on. Disgusting. And so now the Israeli government is cutting deals with these African countries. The idea is, well, if you agree to take some of these unwanted people of color off our hands, then we will bribe you with more weapons and more weapons training so you can make more refugees out of Africans. And so it goes, and that's why you have some protesters here. Israel mocheret neshek. Israel sells arms to murderers and expels the victims. This is what happens. And as it starts to coerce these people to self-deport, within 10 days, you have kids who were born in Israel, who speak perfect Hebrew, and kids already dying from simple communicable diseases that could have been easily treated because they're sending them back to South Sudan, in this case, where there's over 50% of the population has no drinking water. Okay? So Israel is so determined, it doesn't really care what happens. And recently we saw that several of these people who have been deported were since executed by ISIS, if you can imagine that. And of course, we've seen in the media recently how many thousands of people are dying in the Mediterranean every single year, fleeing in every single direction. This is the result, and no small amount of these people. Again, so with Israel sending these people off back to Africa and then continuing to flee from there to find refuge somewhere else, and you have a boat with 1,000 people drowning in the Mediterranean. How does the Israeli government respond? Well, Senior Minister Israel Katz, after that boat with 1,000 refugees drowned, said, "See how correct the government policy was? You can give us a compliment." Yeah. And so once news came out that these Africans who were in Israel and who had to self-deport, who were pressured to self-deport, eventually were executed by ISIS, they had memorial ceremonies at Cholot, at that desert detention center. But at this desert detention center, you also have ceremonies for other events like Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel. And also on Passover, they have a ceremony to honor it, because these people understand. The ones who went through ethnic cleansing, they know what ethnic cleansing is. They know what the Holocaust is. The ones who escaped from Eritrea, from abject slavery, they understand what coming out of slavery is, the meaning of Passover. For many of them, the reason they came to Israel was because they'd heard these myths of the Jewish people, of what they went through in the Holocaust, of their stories, of the Exodus, and they thought that they would find refuge because these people of all people in the world would understand their plight, what they went through. But no, thank you, they do not, the Israeli government does not want them to join the Jewish people in Israel, and it is doing everything it can to prevent that. Even if they want to, most of them are Christians and Muslims, but even if they want to join the Jewish people in some way, you have the conversion czar. If you can imagine, Israel actually has something like this, a conversion czar. And Muli Jesselson, the conversion czar, says, the government built a fence on the border, and we built one here at the entrance gate to the Jewish people. Here we are talking about tens of thousands who want to assimilate into us and have no connection to Judaism. Usually people say, oh, well, Israel's not racist. Okay, even if you're not Jewish, you can become Jewish. So even if we privilege Jewish people, anyone can become Jewish. But we know that's an abject lie, that the government does not want people who are not Jewish to become Jewish. And here we have it from the horse's mouth. And here we have it from Israel's so-called justice or injustice minister until a couple of years ago. Yaakov Neumann said the exact same thing. It's impossible to allow anyone to convert to Judaism. It permits anyone to receive citizenship. Well, he's also said other crazy stuff. But this man, until recently, he is actually Israel's most richest politician. I think it's important to mention this because there is a connection with capitalism here and exploitative other populations, because part of the reason they don't want Africans in Israel is because of racism, and part of the reason is capitalism. Because if you have this group of Africans in the country, then they can work in the country. But that means you won't need to import workers from other parts of the world, primarily the Far East, like people working in agriculture, people from Thailand, or people from China doing construction work, or people from the Philippines doing caretaking work, because there are people who make huge amounts of profits from glorified slave trading, essentially bringing in these workers and getting money from them for the privilege of being able to work in Israel. There's industries that make massive amounts of money, and of course some of these groups contribute very, very nicely to the electoral campaigns of these racist politicians. So one hand washes the other. All right? Now they're willing to let Africans do some of the work, like actually building the fence to prevent any more Africans from entering the country. That they did allow them to do. There's some pretty good metal workers in that community. And we have Israeli politicians now reaping the political currency of this war on Africans. Netanyahu running for re-election in 2013, promoting himself. We stopped the wave of infiltrators from Sinai. But it's not only on the national level, even on the local level we have this. Now imagine walking down the street in your city and seeing a sign like this: to keep those Jews far from my daughter, I'm voting for the Christian Identity Party. Now, of course, this is a sick sign, and it doesn't exist. I hope it never will exist. I made it in Photoshop, right? It doesn't exist, but this does exist. And it's the exact same sign, but in Hebrew, towards Africans. Welcome to Israel 2015. Okay, and so all of this incitement has an effect on the people. All right? So you walk down the street in Tel Aviv and you see graffiti. All right? You have people accosting African people in the streets. People are afraid to leave their houses. Okay, you have rallies, anti-African rallies in the streets of Tel Aviv and other cities around the country. Get out of here. We don't want you here. Go. You're rapists. You're murderers. And so this builds up to a peak in 2012, and we see people firebombing African people's homes. All right? Firing, trying to burn them out. And we see even the firebombing of an African kindergarten in Tel Aviv. Why wasn't this reported in the UK media? All right? Now, that kindergarten that was firebombed, the people who founded the kindergarten for those kids, the man who founded it, he was deported within 6 months, and eventually the person who actually firebombed that kindergarten, he got out without any jail sentence. Okay? So this is the level of impunity, the message to the Israeli people: continue to burn out these Africans, if we're not doing it fast enough. Now, of course, there's some Israelis who are objecting to this, who fight back, who counter-protest, who try to help the Africans, who stand in solidarity, but it's too little, too late, and we see in May 2012 a massive pogrom, 1,000 Israelis running through the streets. First of all, let's put it in perspective, we have top Israeli politicians. We just heard about Miri Regev and others who stood on the podium and who said that the Sudanese are a cancer in our body. Now, I should point out, she apologized a few days later, she said, "I apologize, I did not intend to hurt cancer patients." So, she didn't want to insult cancer patients by comparing them to Africans, so she apologized for this. But after she said this, 1,000 Israelis ran rampant through the streets of Tel Aviv for hours, attacking any dark-skinned person they came across, and smashing stores and cafes operated by Africans, and beating people in the streets. And this is the result. This is Israel today, okay? And so now we have also knife attacks. So African man standing on the street, someone doesn't like the way he looks and, lops his hand off, okay? We even have a family downtown Tel Aviv holding a 1-year-old baby in her mother's arms, and an Israeli comes up and stabs the baby in the head 3 times. Now, of course, not every single Israeli is going to do that. Obviously, this guy is off his rocker, but why did he stab an African baby? And he said it because blacks are terrorists. All blacks babies are terrorists, and this comes straight from the government rhetoric all the way from the top. This is the atmosphere in Israel, and this is the result, if you can imagine that. So I want to be respectful of your time. I'm just ending my talk just to give you a sense that, yes, some people notice this. African ambassadors to Israel from these 6 countries demanded a meeting with the government saying, look, we're afraid to walk the streets at this point. Our wives, we don't know what to do when they want to go for shopping and they're accosted in the streets. You've got to lower the flames. This is the level of anti-African incitement in Israel. And after that infamous anti-African race riot that we saw in Tel Aviv, the people were polled and they were asked, what do you think? Is it legitimate? And sadly, sickeningly, 52% of Jewish Israelis said they agree that the Africans are a cancer. Of course, Miri Regev was then promoted, not fired, but promoted, and then made chair of the Interior Committee, the very committee that determines what happens to those African refugees. We can talk a little bit more, but maybe we'll do that in a Q&A. I think I've horrified you enough for one day. This is the reality of African people. And keep this in mind when you think about what the fate of Palestinian people is and what are the reasons for the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. And is it really about this cycle of violence and this bad blood between them? Is that the reason why there's anti-Palestinian racism? Or could there be some other reasons for anti-Palestinian racism that originate not in the last 100 years of conflict, but in something about the Zionist state and something about anti-Gentile racism that blurs over into any group that's not Jewish, whether there's a history of conflict or absolutely no history of conflict between them. Thank you.